Let me tell you something I've never told anyone. Not fully, not the whole thing. Because every time I start, my voice does this thing, it drops. Like my body knows the story better than my mouth does, and it's trying to protect me from it. From remembering what I saw in that corridor on the Velthari station, on the 32nd night of the third passage census. People ask me sometimes, people who weren't there, they ask what it was like to watch a human walk. Just walk. And I never know how to explain that without sounding dramatic, without sounding like I'm exaggerating. Because the thing is, I've seen humans do extraordinary things since then. I've watched them run into burning reactor chambers. I've watched them lift cargo containers that would require 3 Dreth working in sync. I've watched them argue with Galactic Council delegates without flinching, without backing down, with this sort of magnificent, stupid, burning confidence that makes you feel 2 things at once, awe and terror. But none of that was as strange as watching one of them walk. Just walk. Across a corridor floor, trailing blood from a wound that should have killed him 8 hours earlier. And I saw the expression on Commander Violin's face. A Velhari commander, 311 years old, a veteran of the Karath expansion, a soldier who had watched entire moons go dark, and she froze. She froze. She looked at the human. And she said, very quietly, like the words didn't fully believe themselves, "Human, you should be dead." And the human, Sergeant Marcus Webb, 26 years old, from a place called Appalachian, Ohio, looked down at the wound in his side like he was only just remembering it was there. Then he looked back up at her. And he said, "Yeah, probably, but I've got a job to finish first." I keep telling myself I imagine the part that came after. The way the entire galactic enforcement corridor went quiet. The way the Velhari soldiers, trained, armored, completely combat-hardened soldiers who had never in their lives been asked to feel something they couldn't name, looked at each other. But I didn't imagine it. I was standing right there. Section II, the setup. You have to understand what Velthari Station was back then, what it meant, what it felt like to be standing on it. It was not like anything on Earth, nothing close. Velthari Station was a census hub, one of 14 in the outer corridor system, and it floated in the gravitational pocket between 2 dead stars that had orbited each other for so long they'd stopped pulling and just leaned. Like 2 exhausted things that had been fighting for so long they forgot what they were fighting about and just settled into each other. The station was enormous. Not enormous the way a big airport is enormous, not the kind of scale where you notice it for the first 5 minutes and then your brain adjusts and normalizes it. I mean enormous the way mountains are enormous. The kind of scale where your brain never adjusts, where every single day you walked through those corridor rings, you felt small in a way that was almost religious. It was designed by the Velhari, the dominant architectural species in the outer system, so everything was built for them. The ceilings in the main transit corridors were 40 feet high. The doorframes were 15 feet tall and 6 feet wide. The lighting was tuned to Velhari visual spectra, which meant everything glowed at the faintly blue-silver edge of what human eyes could process, like living inside a perpetual overcast afternoon. The Velhari themselves were something. I don't say that dismissively. I say it the way you say it about anything that genuinely unsettles you while also making you feel like you're witnessing something important. They were tall. The shortest I ever saw was around 8 feet, and Commander Violin stood 9'2". They were bipedal, which humans sometimes find reassuring until they actually see one move, because the proportions are all wrong in ways you can't quite name. The limbs are slightly too long. The neck is slightly too long. The eyes are set wide, deep amber, and they have this quality, this unsettling quality of holding completely still. Not blinking the way humans blink, not the casual constant adjustment of gaze. When a Velhari was looking at you, you knew it. You felt it like a hand on your shoulder. Their armor was extraordinary. The enforcement branch wore composite shell plating, grown, not manufactured, and it moved with them the way a second skin would. It was dark blue-gray, the color of deep water, and in the blue-silver light of the station corridors, it made them look like something out of a myth, something that had been walking through the galaxy long before humans were using fire. Because they had been. The Velhari were old, not just old as a species, though they were, but old in the way that changes how they understood everything. Their history went back so far that human civilization, all of human history from Mesopotamia forward, would fit inside a footnote in their census records. They were not cruel about this. They were not contemptuous in the way you might expect. They were simply distant. The way anyone gets when they've seen enough cycles of things to stop being surprised by them. Humans had been formally integrated into the galactic census for 11 years at the time of this story. 11 years, out of the thousands that the Velhari had been operating the outer corridor system. Humans were, in the language of the Census Bureau, probationary integrated species, which sounds polite but means exactly what you think it means. New, untested, still proving. There were 87 humans on Velthari Station during the third passage census. Mostly support staff, translators, a few logistics coordinators. 3 from the Earth Diplomatic Liaison Office, who spent most of their time looking confused and trying to convert caloric intake requirements between species nutritional charts. And 6 from the Human Military Liaison Detachment. The HMLD was not, despite what some people think, a combat unit. Not technically. They were observers, attachés. They were there to watch how galactic enforcement handled security during census operations, to learn, to report back, to demonstrate that humans could function professionally in a multi-species command environment. They were not expected to be tested. That was the assumption. Marcus Webb was one of the 6. I met Marcus 3 weeks before the incident. I was working as a data coordination specialist for the Census Bureau. I'm a Drethari, for context, which means I look something like a very tall otter crossed with something that had the misfortune of being designed by a committee, and I'll leave it there. And my assignment during the census was corridor sector mapping in the D-ring. Marcus was stationed in D-ring as well, security observation post. I noticed him before I spoke to him, the way you notice anything that doesn't quite fit, not in a bad way, just noticeably different. The way he moved through the corridors. He wasn't cautious in the nervous way that most new integrated species were when they first arrived on a Velhari station. He wasn't performing confidence either, which was the other thing you saw sometimes, species overcompensating, walking too hard, too deliberately. He just moved like he was comfortable, which should have been impossible, given that everything in D-ring was designed for beings twice his height, and the environmental controls kept the corridor temperature at 58 degrees Fahrenheit because Velhari run cold. He wore a thermal underlayer beneath his liaison uniform, and he had, for reasons I never fully understood, taped a small paper photograph to the inside of his helmet visor. I saw it once when he had the visor up. A farmhouse, trees, green hills. He saw me noticing. He said, "Ohio, in fall, best time of year." I said I didn't know what Ohio was. He thought about it. He said, "It's just home." Marcus was not remarkable looking by human standards, based on what I understood of them. Medium height for a human, which meant he stood about a foot shorter than any Velhari in the corridor, and a few inches shorter than me. He had this particular quality of stillness that I'd come to associate with humans who had been in dangerous situations before. Not a nervous stillness, not the stillness of someone holding themselves back, but the stillness of someone who had learned to conserve energy, because they'd been in situations where you couldn't afford to waste it. He had a scar along his left jaw from something he never explained. He drank his coffee at a temperature that made our Velhari environmental control officers visibly disturbed. They had sensors that monitored consumable temperatures for species health compliance, and Marcus consistently consumed liquids at temperatures flagged as potential thermal injury risk on the Velhari scale. When I pointed this out, he shrugged and said that was just how coffee was supposed to taste, and that anything below scalding was just brown water. I filed this observation away. At the time, I thought it was an amusing quirk. Later, I would understand it differently. The census itself was routine in the way that all enormously complex things are called routine by people who have done them long enough to forget how complex they are. Velthari Station processed passage documentation for 63 species during the third passage census. 63 species, all with different documentation requirements, different atmospheric needs, different cultural protocols, different legal classifications under galactic census law. The enforcement branch, Commander Violin's unit, maintained security throughout. The Velhari took security seriously. That is perhaps the understatement of this entire account. They took security with the same seriousness that they took everything, completely, thoroughly, with no interest in half measures. Violin had 48 enforcement officers distributed across 12 corridor sectors, operating in 8-hour rotation cycles, with redundant monitoring systems, and 2 independent AI arbitration networks running simultaneously. Nothing was supposed to go wrong. It was Velthari Station. Nothing went wrong on Velthari Station. Section III The Build. The Keth showed up on the 19th day. I say showed up because that's what it felt like. There's no other word for it. They did not arrive with the kind of formal notice that census arrival protocol required. They did not submit passage documentation at the outer corridor checkpoint. They did not respond to Velhari hailing frequencies on the assigned census channels. They just appeared, endearing 7 of them. Now, here's where I have to stop and explain the Keth to you, because if you've never encountered one, my describing them as 7 of them appeared endearing will not communicate the full weight of what I'm telling you. The Keth are there. Look. There are species in this galaxy that are dangerous, and you know it from reputation. There are species that are dangerous, and you know it from biology, the size, the claws, the chemical signature. And then there are the Keth, who are dangerous in a way that is almost philosophical. They're not the biggest species. They're not the most physically powerful. They average around 7 feet, which on Velthari Station is practically modest. What they are is old in a different way than the Velhari are old. The Velhari are old like an institution is old, accumulated, structured, formal. The Keth are old the way something predatory is old. They've been operating in the outer system since before the galactic census existed, and for most of that time they operated without anyone's permission, without documentation, without the kind of multi-species courtesy frameworks that hold everything together. They were, in the blunt language of galactic census classification, conditionally tolerated. Which meant we know you're here, we know we can't fully stop you, here are the rules, try to follow them, we'll try to enforce them. 7 Keth endearing, without documentation. The Velhari enforcement officers noticed within 4 seconds. 4. The monitoring system flagged the biometric anomaly. The alert went to Violin's command unit, and she had officers moving in under 30 seconds. I was at my workstation in the Deering Data Coordination alcove when it happened. I heard the alert tone, different from any tone I'd heard in 3 weeks of census work, lower, with a pulse pattern that I recognized from training as meaning something I had never expected to actually hear. Unauthorized presence, unknown classification. I looked up through the alcove's transparency panel. I could see the Keth. They were standing in the corridor like they owned it. Not aggressively, that's not quite right. More like they had decided they were allowed to be there and were waiting for someone to explain otherwise. They wore traveling kit, not combat armor, which the enforcement AI noted in its report, but which I remember thinking meant nothing because Keth traveling kit is not like what most species mean by traveling kit. It still has integrated shielding and a weapon suppression field that could make a standard Velhari sidearm jam at close range. The lead Keth was female, recognizable by the secondary crest pattern, broader and more complex than the males. She was studying the corridor, sealing the way someone studies a map, slowly, carefully, like she was counting something. And then she looked directly at the transparency panel I was standing behind. Directly at me. I don't know how she saw me through a panel rated for visual privacy at all non-Keth spectra. I don't know. But she looked right at me, and the expression on her face was the expression of something that has been patient for a very long time and is running out of patience. I stepped back from the panel, and that was when I heard the human voice from the corridor to my right. Not panicked, not even loud, just clear. Marcus Webb, Sergeant, Human Military Liaison Detachment, said, "Hey, you need to stop there. This is a restricted transit zone. I'm going to need to see documentation." I moved to a different panel, the one that gave me a view of the corridor intersection. Marcus was standing between the Keth group and the corridor that led deeper into Deering's documentation processing hub. He was alone. He was in his liaison uniform, thermal underlayer, the Earth diplomatic liaison patch on the shoulder, no armor, no weapons beyond the standard issue sidearm that every HMLD member carried, and that I was now extremely certain would be useless against Keth shielding. He was holding a scanner. And he was standing in front of 7 Keth like he was a parking enforcement officer, explaining a ticketing procedure. The lead Keth, I will call her Prime Keth because I never learned her name and the enforcement report lists her as Subject 1, looked at Marcus the way you look at something you weren't expecting to encounter. Not afraid, not angry, just recalibrating. She said something in Keth. I had enough census training to understand maybe 60% of Keth speech, and even that partial comprehension made my blood pressure do something uncomfortable, because what she said was a classification. She classified Marcus, and the classification she used was the Keth term for unthreatening obstacle. Not civilian, not guard, not even being. The word she used was more like a thing in the way. One of the other Keth, a male, larger than the Prime, standing about a foot taller than Marcus, moved forward 2 steps. Marcus didn't move back. He said, "I understand you may not have documentation. I can walk you through the census intake process, but I need you to stay in this section of the corridor until enforcement personnel arrive." That's not a suggestion. The large male Keth said something. My Keth translation gets shaky here. It was fast, and the register was one I wasn't trained for, but my best interpretation was something like, "I could remove you with one hand." Marcus looked at the large male. He said, "Probably, but that would make paperwork for everybody easier if you just wait." The Velhari enforcement officers arrived 40 seconds later. 40 seconds. I know because I checked the incident log afterward. I was terrified in that data alcove for 40 of the longest seconds of my professional life, watching Marcus Webb stand in a corridor in front of 7 Keth with a census scanner in his hand, and he never moved. Not back, not sideways. He held that position like it was where he was supposed to be, and any alternative hadn't occurred to him. Commander Violin was with the first response team. She assessed the situation in the way that Velhari enforcement commanders assess situations. Completely, in about 2 seconds, with no visible emotional response. She addressed the Prime Keth in formal outer corridor Keth, the diplomatic register, the one that acknowledges their age and status while still being absolute about the law. And the conversation that followed was long and careful and ultimately resolved with the Keth agreeing to undergo census documentation intake at a priority processing station. The whole thing lasted about 7 minutes from the moment Marcus first spoke to the moment the Keth moved to the intake station. 7 minutes. After it was over, after the Keth were moving and the enforcement team was managing the corridor, Violin walked to where Marcus was standing. She looked at him. She didn't say anything for a moment. Then she said in standard galactic, "You held your position." Marcus said, "Yes, ma'am." She said, "You are human liaison. You are not enforcement." "Yes, ma'am." "You were not required to engage." "No, ma'am." "Why did you?" Marcus thought about it. He said, because they were walking toward the processing hub, and nobody else was in the corridor. Violin looked at him for another moment. Then she walked away. I watched her go. I watched her pause just briefly at the corridor junction. And I saw her, just barely, just for a second, do what I can only describe as recalibrate. The way you recalibrate when something hasn't matched your expectations and you're not yet sure what to do with that information. That was the 19th day. The incident happened on the 32nd. Section IV, the escalation. The census was in its final documentation push. Everything was moving fast. The processing hub was running at triple capacity, which meant that every corridor in Deering was operating at peak transit volume, beings moving constantly, documentation being filed and cross-referenced and flagged across 63 species simultaneously. The atmosphere in the station had that particular quality that comes at the end of long institutional operations. Exhaustion wearing the costume of efficiency, everyone moving quickly because there wasn't much left and they wanted it done. It was day 31 when the Keth Prime, Subject 1 from the earlier incident, filed a formal complaint. I won't go through the full bureaucratic chain of what happened next because it would take longer than the incident itself. The short version is, the complaint alleged an irregularity in her documentation processing, a wrong species classification in the transit record that could have had significant legal consequences for her passage rights across 6 outer corridor checkpoints. The complaint was legitimate, the error was real. It had been made during the intake process following the Deering incident, and the person responsible for that part of the documentation chain was a Drethari logistics coordinator who had been working a 16-hour shift and made a transcription error. That Drethari was me. It was my error. I had been working a 16-hour shift. I had transposed 2 characters in the species classification code. It was a small mistake. The kind of thing that happens. The kind of thing that the census documentation system is supposed to catch through its review layers. It didn't catch it. So on day 31, I was called to the enforcement station in Deering to present my documentation logs and explain the error. Commander Violin conducted the review herself. I don't know if this was routine or if the Keth Prime had requested a senior officer. Probably the latter. The Keth Prime was present for part of it. She had that right under census documentation protocol, and she watched me go through my logs with the particular quality of attention that the Keth seemed to apply to everything. Total, unblinking, the kind of attention that makes you feel like you're being read rather than observed. The review took 3 hours. The error was documented, the correction was filed. The Keth Prime's passage rights were reinstated with full status, and I received a formal notation in my census record. Not a serious one, not a disciplinary one, just a notation. Standard procedure. At the end of it, the Keth Prime said something to me as she left. Direct address, in Galactic Standard, which she spoke fluently. She said, "Your kind makes errors. This one was corrected. The next will also be corrected, or it will not. We do not hold corrections against the corrector. I said, thank you. She said, do not thank me. It is simply how things are measured. Then she left. And I went back to Deering. This is the part where I need to tell you what was happening in the sections of the station that I wasn't in. I'm telling you secondhand here, from the incident report, from what Marcus told me afterward, from the security footage review that the enforcement branch eventually shared with the Human Diplomatic Liaison Office. I've cross-referenced all of it as carefully as I can. What I'm about to tell you is, to the best of my knowledge, accurate. The Keth Prime was not the only Keth on the station with a complaint. There were 4 others, other Keth from the same traveling group, each with their own documentation that had been processed during the Deering incident intake. And it turned out, through a cascade of the same transcription error chain, that all 4 had similar classification issues in their transit records. This was discovered on day 31, same day as my review. And the way it was discovered was not through the normal documentation review process. It was discovered because 3 of the 4 Keth had gone back to the Deering processing hub on their own to request corrections. And the 4th, the large male, the one who had told Marcus he could remove him with one hand, had gone somewhere else. He had gone to find the person responsible. Me. I didn't know this at the time. I was in the enforcement station. I was completely unaware. What the security footage shows, what I watched later, more times than was probably healthy, in the small hours of a station night in the debriefing room, is this. The large male Keth, the enforcement report calls him Subject 2, entered Deering Corridor Junction 14C at 19:43 station time. I was in 14B at that point, having just left the enforcement station, 3 minutes out. Marcus was at his observation post at the 14C junction. Subject 2 came around the corner doing the thing I described earlier, that sense of having already decided the space was his. He was moving with direction. He had somewhere to go. Marcus stepped into his path. The footage shows it clearly. Marcus was at his post. He saw Subject 2's trajectory. He calculated where it was going, and he stepped into the corridor. Not aggressively, just there. He said something that the audio pickup in that corridor didn't catch completely. The Keth shielding was creating electromagnetic interference, but from what was audible and from what Marcus told me later, it was something like, I can't let you go down that corridor right now. I need to know where you're headed. Subject 2 said the Keth register again, and this time I had the recording professionally translated. He said, I go where I go. You stopped me once. That courtesy was extended. It will not be extended again. Marcus said, what's in that corridor that you need? Subject 2 said, the error maker. Marcus said, the documentation review is in process. If you have a complaint about the documentation process, I can connect you with. Subject 2 moved forward. Fast. The footage caught it in a way that my description won't do justice to. Keth move in a way that violates expectations, not just because of speed, which is significant, but because of the smoothness of it. There's no telegraphing. It's as if the motion begins and ends without the steps in between that most species show. He moved forward and his arm came out, and he, in the language of the enforcement report, applied species-appropriate force to the human liaison's thoracic region, which means he hit Marcus in the chest with a closed fist. A Keth closed fist. The force calculation in the incident report lists the impact at something equivalent to being struck by a mid-weight vehicle at moderate speed. Marcus went into the corridor wall. The wall had a small Keth-sized dent in it afterward. Marcus slid down the wall to the floor. The footage shows him not moving for 3 seconds. 3 seconds. Subject 2 started down the corridor. The footage shows the next part very clearly. Marcus got up. 3 seconds. 3 seconds of not moving, of being crumpled against a wall at the base of a dent that his body had made in it, and then he got up. Not fast, not like a movie, like something that required effort, like something that was being done through calculation rather than reaction. One hand on the wall, one knee up, then the other, then standing. He was breathing differently. The audio picked this up heavier, with a particular quality that I later understood meant he'd taken damage to something internal. Ribs, possibly more. The medical report that came later would specify. He was also bleeding. The impact had done something to his left side. The wall had a protrusion, some kind of conduit housing, and when he'd hit it, it had torn through the liaison uniform and through what was underneath. A significant wound. Not, I learned later, with the particular sick relief of retrospect, not immediately fatal but significant. Subject 2 was 15 feet down the corridor when Marcus stood up. Marcus said, loudly, in the carrying way that I would come to understand was something specific to the way humans project sound when they mean to be heard. I said, you can't go down this corridor. Subject 2 stopped. He turned around slowly. He looked at Marcus. And I think I've watched the footage many times, and this is my interpretation, not the reports. I think he was genuinely confused. Not alarmed, not frightened, just confused. In the way that you're confused when something does something that violates your model of how it works. He had hit Marcus with enough force to put a dent in a Velhari-grade station wall. Marcus was standing. Not just standing, standing between him and the corridor, still. Subject 2 said, and this was captured more clearly because the shielding interference had shifted, he said, you should not be standing. Marcus said, probably not, that's my problem. You going back to the intake station is yours. The footage shows Marcus's left hand pressing against his side, against the wound. He was already trying to manage the blood loss, and he was doing it with one hand while standing in the corridor in front of a Keth, who had just demonstrated what he could do, and was looking at him like he was a problem that needed to be reclassified. Subject 2 took 2 steps back toward Marcus, and Marcus took 1 step forward. 1 step into the 2 steps, closing the distance rather than creating it. Subject 2 stopped again. He looked at Marcus. And this time, the thing I see in the footage, the thing that I cannot fully explain, is that he stopped not because he was afraid of Marcus. He stopped because Marcus had done something that violated the framework he was operating from. He had closed distance with a Keth who had just demonstrated lethal capability. He had moved toward the threat. And Subject 2 didn't have a category for that. The enforcement officers arrived 41 seconds later. Commander Violin arrived 43 seconds after that. She came around the junction at 14C moving fast. I've never seen a Velhari move that fast outside of training footage, and Violin was 311 years old and had the stillness of something ancient. And she took in the scene in the corridor in the way she took everything in, which was all at once and completely. Subject 2 standing in the corridor. Marcus standing between him and the rest of D-Ring. The blood on the floor. The dent in the wall. Marcus's hand pressed to his side, the uniform dark and wet. She said something sharp in enforcement Velhari to her officers' orders, moving them into position around Subject 2, containment formation, smooth and practiced. Then she walked past them. She walked to Marcus, and she stopped about 3 feet from him, and she looked at his side, and she looked at his face, and she froze. That's the only word. She froze. Not like she was afraid, not like she was surprised in a dramatic way, more like something had encountered her model of how the universe worked and didn't fit into it, and her extraordinarily sophisticated mind was, for one brief moment, buffering. And then she said it. quietly, like the words were thinking themselves out loud. Human, you should be dead.